Tonight we're going to consider the words of Jesus Christ where he said, "The meek shall inherit the earth." And bound up in this phrase is a concept so powerful, so important, that it's going to bring about world peace. It's going to bring about world change. And we really believe this, and we'd like to share this story with you tonight about how the idea of meekness is a vital part in bringing about a total change to this world and making the world a better place. And also it can make our own lives a better place. It's not a particularly complex concept, but we will have a bit of a look into it tonight. If you look down through time, there is actually one aspect that's missing in so many of societies. If we were to go through history, you'll find that this idea of meekness is missing in society. When society first started, or mankind's history first came out of the gloom, there was this pre-Bronze Age era where society started to form into groups. And we could go further back than that and start talking about the very early beginning. But that's not the topic of tonight. In the early formative years recorded, there were families. And there were groups of people who bunched together in tribes or families. They were brutal times. The people decided that they would be self-willed, that they would run things their own way. And we haven't got time, we're not going to delve into it tonight, but if we go back to the time of Noah, the classic story of this came to an end in the times of Noah. The classic story of families and people running as tribes and doing their own thing came to an end in the times of Noah. And God saw fit to actually make a clean start. The flood was a way of wiping clean the slate and starting over. Why? Because of several features that the world had taken on because of their own selfish decisions. And they were violence, and every man did that which he imagined. The imagination of man's heart was evil continually and acted on it. So society, in a sense, came to an end, a destruction, because people were doing their own thing. That's essentially what we're going to boil it down to. And that outcome was cruelty to the weaker. The weak people were oppressed by the more violent. So we had that story where Noah and his ark were the only ones that were saved, and the animals and the people that were in it. But after that, mankind started to grow into nations, and nations started to spring into being, and history records all sorts of nations, particularly around the area of the Fertile Crescent around Egypt. And with the growth of these nations, we had probably the rise to power of several. Egypt and Assyria were the first notable sort of powers to rise up out of Mesopotamian region. This didn't end very well either. The era of, say, the Assyrians was noted for its cruelty. In fact, one of the prophets in Bible times come of mankind doing what he sees is fit. The Assyrians fell, like so many others, and were replaced by the Babylonians. The Babylonians, well, if we read through the story of Daniel, which describes so much of the history of Babylon, we can see that they were particularly self-willed. You know, the king of Babylon had so many of the stones in in Babylon stamped with his name. He looked out upon the city and said, "Is not this great Babylon that I have built?" And he ran the world his way. View of history that we're going skimming across the surface. You see, every age finishes up with oppression of the weaker people, cruelty, man making his own decisions. There's a lack of listening to God's advice, and every time man does what looks right in his own eyes. That characterises each of the different eras of mankind and each of the different forms of government. Whether you want to talk about just families and tribes, it ended up in cruelty. Now we've gone to nations, that finished up in cruelty. What about empires? Well, there was conquest of other nations and much cruelty and death. The greatest of the empires was actually Rome, and Rome was the most powerful and lasted so long, and yet it crumbled also in the end. And there were all sorts of forms of cruelty that sprung up in the end of Rome, particularly. Even though it saw itself as the pinnacle of knowledge and wisdom, and saw itself as a much more refined nation than perhaps, say, Assyria or some of those earlier kingdoms, Rome was actually fell apart because of its lack of care for its citizens. One of the classic stories about the fall of Rome is that on the Italian peninsula, they were shipping in sand. And because they wanted sand for their gladiators to play on, for their sports matches, they wanted this so much they were shipping in sand. Now, sand is kind of heavy stuff to ship. So if you bring a shipload of sand, you probably can't put much more in the ship or it's going down. So they didn't bring in food. So the result of that was, for the common people who couldn't afford whatever the price was, the price of food skyrocketed and the rich people didn't care a less. It was part of the fall of Rome. What about beyond that? When we got past that age and we went into this age beyond that, where the Catholic, the Rome actually dissolved and Europe was a place ruled by both, in one hand, kings, and on the other hand, there were the priests, the Catholic Church, the Dark Ages. Was that a time of enlightenment when people cared for one another? Or was it a time when people did what they thought best and the outcome turned out to be cruelty? Well, it pretty much turned out to be cruelty. Most of the way through the Dark Ages, for many hundreds of years, people were oppressed they were unable to read or write certain things. They had to have the church's permission to do that. As an outcome, the average age of most people was about 24. So that was your life expectancy that you could have during the Dark Ages because knowledge was suppressed. Why was it suppressed? Man's decision. Well, beyond the Dark Ages, we say that the world broke out of that into this Renaissance, age of enlightenment. And we grew from that, but we didn't. We came along and we had the French Revolution. What triggered the French Revolution? Well, there's that famous phrase where the rich got so rich because of the new way of living that they oppressed the poor more and more and more until eventually the poor rebelled and a sweeping range of revolutions went across Europe. And the famous phrase of when they asked a certain lady about whether they should give the people bread because they didn't have any, she said, well, if you don't have bread, give them cake. She had no concept that the poor were that oppressed that they had no concept of what cake probably even looked like. So we've moved on from that, haven't we? We've got better. We've actually listened to each other. We haven't been so selfish. We've moved on into the Industrial Revolution where everything's got better. We've got all these new machines. And people work harder and people are more tied to their jobs. And the advent of machinery hasn't actually changed the repression of society, the repression of the poor and needy, because people still do what they do for themselves. In fact, some of the driving force behind some of the Industrial Revolution was actually the idea that you need to have the survival of the fittest. If you're the person who's the top dog, you can overcome and repress others. And what it did was it pushed out the manufacturing to the poorer classes. And so there was a society was still divided between rich and poor. And now, do we see any difference with the modern age of globalisation? No. We're outsourcing poverty into other countries. If you don't want to be repressed here, that's fine. We just outsource it here. And yet people are still not happy. What am I trying to say with this overview of history? Well, there's really a couple of points I'd like to stand out for you. One, mankind's never very kind to each other. And two, the reason is because they do things for their own selfish reasons. And I guess three, it doesn't matter what form of government you want to use, feudalism, communism, empires, democracy even, it doesn't change. People still do the same thing. They think about number one first. And as a result, society finds itself in a terrible state. We'd like to share something different with you tonight. What we'd like to share with you tonight is that there is another option, that the Bible presents another way which is different and better and delightful. And it comes in these simple words of Christ, which he says in Matthew chapter 5. You don't have to turn there because I'm just going to read that one verse, and actually he's quoting from the chapter we read tonight. So in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 5, we were told that the meek shall inherit the earth. That's what Christ said. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. It's from his Beatitudes. It's from his step-by-step plan on how to be blessed, how to be happy. And he gives this outline, but it comes from Psalm 37. And Psalm 37 is a much more detailed explanation of the difference between the meek and the wicked. And you can see the core quote where he actually is quoting from here says a little more than just what Christ says, a little more detail. Verse 11, "But the meek shall inherit the earth and shall delight themselves in the abundance of peace." So you see there's not only this idea that they will inherit the earth, but they'll inherit a good earth. It's an earth which is filled with peace. This is God's plan in Psalm 37. This is what he hopes to accomplish, is the bringing about of this new world order where we've got the meek instead of the wicked. Let's make a little comparison, shall we? Just through this chapter. We read it together, and I'd just like to spot pick, if you like. I'm going to miss some perhaps. You may come up with a different list. I'm just going to pick some of the characteristic features of the wicked versus the meek to help us to see the difference. And I think what you'll see as we go through is that when we look at the wicked, over and over again, it just looks like society driven by man's own selfish desires that we've talked about so far. Let's compare the meek and the wicked. First, the evildoers, the wicked. Verse 1 and 2 talk about the evildoers or workers of iniquity, and they're cut down like grass. That's the end. Now, this is God telling us what the future will be like. He's telling us about what the world will be like, and he has the authority to do this. We can see, and it's a subject of another lecture that you can hear from this place or check out our recordings, about the way that the Bible accurately predicts the future, because God has accurately predicted the past. He's got the power to do it. He's got the power to predict the future, and he's shown that time and time again. So here he is. He's predicting what will happen to the evildoers and the workers of iniquity. They that are angry and wrathful shall be cut off. The wicked, they shall for a little while, and they shall not be. We see them around now. We see society. We see rulers who are wicked and oppress their population for the sake of cash and run their countries into the ground. Well, in the end, those people will not be. They plot against the just, but his day shall come, as in the day that the wicked shall come to an end. They draw the sword, they bend the bow, they cast down and slay the upright. But the sword in the end will enter into his heart, and his bow will be broken. The wicked's arms will be broken. The wicked are the enemies of Yahweh, but they will perish. They will be consumed away as smoke. He borrows and payeth not again. But the cursed, he is cursed, and he will be cut off. So there's some descriptions of some of the evildoers, but you can see so much about the oppression that mankind has had over the ages. What about the meek? What are they like? Well, it's just the opposite. They trust and do good, and they will dwell in the land and be fed. They delight in Yahweh, and he gives them the desires of their heart. They commit themselves to him, and they trust in him, and he will bring it to pass and bring about their judgment. They rest in Yahweh, or in the Lord, and therefore they need not fret themselves for the wicked. They wait upon Yahweh, they will inherit the earth. They will inherit and have abundance of peace, which we read. He is righteous, his little is better than the wicked's riches. He is righteous and upright. Yahweh upholdeth him, gives him an inheritance forever. He shall not be ashamed. The meek are merciful and giving, and he will be blessed and inherit the earth. And a good man, I've cut that off again, ordered by the Lord, and he delighteth in his way, and the Lord will uphold him with his hand. Now, we need to define what this meekness is, because in modern day society, meekness is somewhere along the lines of cowardice. The meek person is the one who never stands up for themselves. They sit in the corner and they have a small squeaky voice and say very little and are very timid. That seems to be the modern interpretation of the word meekness. And yet that doesn't exist in this psalm. This psalm that gives us a picture of what true meekness is about has a very recurrent theme. Let's just see if we can highlight some of these words here. He trusts, he delights, he commits, he trusts, he rests, he waits. Well, he's meek, but we're looking for a definition of that. He's righteous, he's merciful, he's a good man, and he ordered his way. They're all about someone who listens and takes characteristics from God himself. They're not something that comes naturally to you. And this is the problem with society. They respond, they behave depending on what looks right to them and what naturally looks right to them. This is different. This person shows characteristics that they've learned from God himself. You know, in the Bible, there's a particular person. I'm just going to do a very short character study, or case study, if you like, about a man called Moses. You see, when we're talking about meekness, if we want to define a little further, Moses actually defines meekness. There's a quote in Numbers chapter 12 that talks about Moses, and it says, "Now Moses was very meek above all the men that were upon the face of the earth." What did this meek man appear like? Well, if you read the first and early life of Moses, you actually won't think he's very meek at all. You see, what Moses did is he decided that he was going to lead the nation in a revolt against Egypt. And in order to do it, he thought he'd trigger the revolt by killing an Egyptian. It seems that perhaps he did it in a degree in anger. Moses seems like a very self-willed and strong character. And there was absolute clear from the story of Moses that he's leadership material. He's got all the characteristics of a true leader, and it doesn't look like the certain person that we call meek. So when we first look at that, I guess the point I want to make is this, is that a meek person may not naturally, in their native state, by character, be the quiet one. Some of us might be the quiet one. We might be naturally born quiet people. Moses wasn't. Moses was someone who actually solved problems with his fists in that particular case. But Moses went through a great change in his life, and I think it's the latter part of Moses' life that he's called the meekest man in all the earth, because Moses fell into disaster, he ran away, and he fled into Midian, and God had to wake him up in that situation and say to him, "You've got to go back, and you've got to take back on the mission that I've called you to, which is being saviour of the people of Israel, saving them from Egypt." And he was humble enough to actually listen, to accept, to understand that he'd run away from God and be willing to return on the mission of freeing Israel from slavery. But he doubted his own capabilities. He doubted his own ability himself. But he did what he was told. And because he did what he was told, he achieved an enormous amount. He obeyed God's instructions, and he brought many great and miraculous events into the world scene. He brought the plagues, he brought the people out in the Exodus, and then he took them through the wilderness wanderings. How did he do that? Because there was an amazing partnership that developed between God and Moses. And that partnership was that Moses heard, and he listened and obeyed. Now, am I saying that Moses gave up on his own opinion? That what meekness is that we should have no personal opinion of our own? That we shouldn't think, just do. Do what you're told. Is that meekness? Well, when we look at the story of Moses, that's not the case. God doesn't take him through that. What happens is Moses willingly submits himself to a higher authority because the higher authority, in this case God, has a better idea than him. He comes along with questions. He cries out to God for assistance and help. But when he gets that help, he doesn't say, "Well, you know what, I'm going to stick with my own opinion." He says no. He falls down and on his face bows down to God and goes and does what God has said. And the outcome was marvellous. So true meekness, if we can summarise, is this. It's not necessarily that the person themselves are born quiet and timid. True meekness might actually be a very powerful leadership sort of character. But that meekness is seen when that person decides to subdue their own personal natural reactions and say, "I'll listen, I'll look for God's advice because I know that God's advice is better." And it's not that they're throwing away their opinions, it's that they're listening to the person whose opinion they value the most and taking these ideas of God's on board for themselves and making them their own because they believe in them. Now, that's a very simple concept, really, and yet it's something that's been lacking in world leadership down through time. Let's just look at what the Bible has to say. If we were to say, just for a moment, for the rest of tonight, what would the world look like if we gave up on our own selfish opinions and said, we'll listen to God. We'll see if his ideas are right and we'll take those opinions on. Well, God said that that is exactly what is going to happen, and the world is going to be a different place because of it. First of all, he describes for us a particular ruler that's going to rule by that method and bring about a new world order. This is something that hasn't happened yet. We haven't seen this with all those empires down through time, but it's going to come. Come with me to Isaiah 11. We've got 3 or 4 quotes to look at that are core quotes about how this new age that's going to dawn is going to be run. Look at Isaiah 11. This is speaking about the leader that's going to run the world in the future age, in the world that God is going to set up, where he's going to make the meek inherit the earth. When that promise comes to pass, what will it look like? What will the ruler look like? Well, verse 2, the Spirit of Yahweh shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of Yahweh. So what it's saying is, these principles, these concepts, these ideas, this spirit that God has of understanding, knowledge, the fear of God, will, as it were, rest on him. These ideas will become his ideas. And he shall make him of quick understanding in the fear of Yahweh. And he shall not judge after the sight of his eyes, neither reprove after the hearing of his ears. What's this? A king that doesn't make decisions based on what he can see and what he can hear right in front of him and what his brain tells him? No, this is right. This king will actually make decisions based on a different authority. It's on God's wisdom. Now, this is brilliant because every ruler up until now, do you see the problem they've got? They need to rely on their own fallible intuition. That's how rulers actually work. They make a decision, they make a judgment based on their own fallible ideas. And it turns out badly. Whereas what this one will do, this ruler, when he comes, will do, is he will make his decisions based on an infallible decision maker, God's decisions. But with righteousness, verse 4, shall he judge the poor and reprove with equity, that means equalness, for the meek of the earth. He shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips shall he slay the wicked. Well, that's never been done before. The wicked are usually the most profitable. You hang on to them. That's what most politicians will do, because that's how you get your income. Repress the poor and make the most out of the wicked. And righteousness shall be the girdle of his loins, and faithfulness the girdle of his reins. The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and the little child shall lead them. And the cow and the bear shall feed, and their young ones shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. And the sucking child shall play on the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the cockatrice den. The asp and the cockatrice are different types of snake, if you're not aware. And they shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of Yahweh as the waters cover the sea. And in that day there shall be a root of Jesse, which shall stand for an ensign of the people. And to it shall the Gentiles seek, and his rest shall be glorious. Now why, in this middle of this passage, just think about it for a minute, why does he suddenly talk about animals? Is it really that he's talking about animals? Well, he's talking about in his holy mountain, so around the place where the king rules, and we say that's Jerusalem. We can prove that in another talk. Around Jerusalem, there'll be a place where animals and people can exist together, even violent and nasty animals. Why would that be? Well, the answer is because it's symbolic of this change that's going to occur across the world. This will be a picture, a cameo picture, if you like, of how violence will be eradicated throughout the world. Something that there's been endemic in human society down through time, where the strong and the violent repress the poor. And here's a symbol of what the world is going to be like It's going to be a place where people live in peace and harmony, as if children leading a dangerous animal. Why? Well, you should have highlighted in there, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. That's the secret. Now, that's not going to make any difference unless people are meek. Because people may have knowledge of God's word, but unless they're actually meek enough to take that on board, it doesn't bring world peace. Here's the problem. The Bible's been around for years. Best-selling book ever. Society's not meek enough to take it on board. All the answers are there, but if they took that on board, they'd lose money. They'd lose power. They'd lose fame. They can't do that. So they don't. And as a result, mankind lives in lack of peace. I want you to take you to another quote now. Come across to Micah chapter 4. Now, I've put a picture up on screen, which is an odd picture. Some would say that's my native homeland of New Zealand, where the wind blows so hard that the trees grow sideways. But I think it's actually somewhere in Scotland. And it's a place where the river flows down the hill and then back up again. And people go there to see this. It's a tourist attraction because of the shape of the hills. They go to see this because water flowing uphill doesn't happen. Come to Micah chapter 4 though. And look in Micah chapter 4 verse 1. But in the last days it shall come to pass that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established on the top of the mountains. It shall be exalted above the hills, and the people shall flow unto it. And the description is like water, flowing unto it. Water does not flow up mountains. Not normally. This is a very rare and unusual case motivated by extremely strong wind. It doesn't naturally flow uphill. And in this case, though, people will put in the effort. They'll go up as if it's water flowing uphill. Why? Not because they're blowing, but because they want to. And many nations shall come and shall say, let us go up to the house of to the mountain of Yahweh and to the house of the God of Jacob. What for? It comes back down to meekness. It's about a new type of wisdom that changes the world. The world is not going to be changed by money. I know there's plenty of organisations that will tell you that. They'll ask for your money because they're saying they're going to change the world with it. It's not going to happen. We're being told here that the way that the world will be changed is by God's word and people being meek enough to take it on board. To the house of the God of Jacob. Why? And he shall teach us his ways. We will walk in his paths. I think that's meekness. To be taught and to walk in his paths. They've given up on their own imaginations, their own desires. What for? In order to walk in his paths. Why will they do that? What motivates them to do that? Well, look at this. For the law shall go forth from Zion, and the word of Yahweh from Jerusalem. He shall judge among many people, rebuke strong nations afar off. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. But they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid, for the mouth of Yahweh of hosts has spoken it. For all the people will walk every one in the name of his gods, and we will walk in the name of Yahweh our God forever and ever. You see, the point of what's being said here is the thing that changes the world is a new type of understanding, a new type of wisdom, and the fact that people have the meekness to actually learn it. And when they do, they'll have world peace, something that they long for but can't achieve. Why? Because they continue to walk in their own selfish ways. It's very simple. And yet you see how these core quotes about the age to come both include this idea of learning, of teaching. It's there in Isaiah 11. Here it is as the key point here in Micah chapter 4. I want to show you one more that I find really neat. Come across to Isaiah 25. And I'll put this picture up on the screen here with someone blindfolded. Because Isaiah 25 says something about our wisdom. Isaiah 25 and verse 6. And in this mountain shall Yahweh of hosts make unto all people a feast of fat things, a feast of wine on the lees, of fat things full of marrow, of wine on the lees, full well refined. So it's talking about the best food. It's the best possible feast. And he will destroy in that mountain the face of the covering cast over all people, and the veil spread over all nations. He will swallow up death in victory, and Yahweh God will wipe away all tears from off all faces, and the rebuke of his people shall be taken away from all the earth, for Yahweh hath spoken it. And it shall be said in that day, Lo, this is our God, we have waited for him, he will save us. This is Yahweh, we have waited for him, we will be glad and rejoice in his salvation. So here we have this story, and the story describes of this beautiful feast, and in that feast, the veil is taken off their faces. And as a result, God will wipe away all tears. What's the veil? What's the veil? It's that we think we're smart. We think, in this day and age, that we live in the smartest possible age of all mankind. We can put people on the moon. We can walk around with a computer in our pockets, or you can have one on your wrist if you like. We think we're so clever. But in that day, when Christ actually reveals to mankind and says, there's some very simple things. If you listen to my way, you can actually have peace. It'll feel as if a blindfold's been lifted off your face. You'll scratch your heads afterwards and think, but why could not we see before? The answer is, we were blinded by our own desires and our own imagination. And when God actually removes that, not only in the same moment will he remove that blindfold of ignorance, but he'll also wipe away all tears. So much of the suffering and sorrow that mankind endures will be gone. I just find that absolutely marvellous. And I think that now, today, people call this the age of technology, the age of Facebook, the age of the internet, of all knowledge. In that day, I think we'll call our day, right now, the age of ignorance, the age of the blindfold. Won't that be nice? Because in that day, we'll live better, because the world, guided by God's knowledge, will be a place where all tears can be wiped away from all faces. There's so many more quotes we could talk about, but essentially the Christadelphians talk about these all the time. If you come along, we invite you to, please come along to Christadelphian lectures. You'll find there's plenty of other quotes that tell us about that wonderful age. That there's Psalm 72, and I'd encourage you, if you really want to boost, if you're feeling like times are tough, please go home and just quietly read through Psalm 72. If you haven't done it for a while, even if you're someone who studies the Bible regularly, it's warming to see how this world will be. And it's because someone's meek enough to take on God's righteousness and God's judgments, and that saves the poor and the needy. Today, mankind is flat out trying to get what he can, and it destroys the planet. Not just the people, but the planet that we live on. Well, Isaiah says, and I like this from Rotherham's, the wilderness and the parched land shall be glad for them. The waste plain shall exult and blossom as the lily. There's actually a change. You saw in Isaiah where it talked about them turning their weapons of war into instruments of agriculture, because the world will be changed. We'll be focused on providing, not fighting and conquering. We won't be focused on, as mankind is today, to take what he can. We'll be looking at the earth that gives, and we'll be looking at how we can give back. And the earth will give abundantly. Here's another quote that talks about how the world will change with this change of perspective. Isaiah 35, the burning sands shall become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. In the haunt of jackals where they lie down, the grass shall become reeds and rushes. One more, because I like it. Behold, the days come, saith Yahweh, that the ploughman shall overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes him that soweth seed. And the mountain shall drop sweet wine, and all the hills shall melt. It's poetic. It describes a wonderful time where mankind's more interested in feeding and caring for his fellow man than he is about what he can get for himself. It's only meekness that's going to actually change the world, when we actually are willing to take on God's word, and that will be the characteristic feature of the age to come. in just those few quotes we've looked at, and we could have looked at more, what we can see is that it's learning God's righteousness that changes the world. You want to be part of that, ladies and gentlemen? You want to be part of a better world? Well, it's time to start today. Jesus, as he left his disciples with a mission. And that mission is in the last chapter of Mark 16. You want to be meek? Start today. Here's the challenge. Jesus said, "Go into all the world and proclaim the gospel to the whole creation, every person. Whosoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whosoever does not believe will be condemned." What he's asking there, what Jesus is asking of every person on this planet is, find the truth that God has given now. Find the gospel message, the good news, take it on board in belief and action. Baptism is the first step in a life of action. And we'd invite you, friends, to join us, Christadelphians, as we study the Bible. If there's questions you have or things we can help you to understand the Bible, please join us as we research these things further through our lectures and our studies together. But our aim is to be meek. Our aim in all of this is not to come out with our own opinions, but to take on the wonderful gospel message, the truth that God holds out freely to all mankind, because only by that will the world become a better place and the place of peace that he has described. Thank you.